Hello, welcome to Bogan Intel. Today's guest is Geoff Raby. Geoff is an economist, former ambassador to China, and has spent 27 years at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, including ambassador roles at APEC and the WTO. Geoff offers critical insights into global power shifts and joins us to speak on how Australia can balance its ties with China and the United States, how it can prepare for a multipolar world, navigate AUKUS and the Quad, and manage regional tensions like Taiwan and the South China Sea, as well as strengthening ASEAN partnerships and exploring steps on how we can define a sovereign middle power role in the Asia Pacific region. Let's get started. Thanks for joining us, Geoff Raby. I appreciate you coming on the program.
My pleasure.
Wanted to get started off speaking to Australia's role in the Indo-Pacific, which will
Yes.
be, basically what we'd be speaking about today. And I wanted to know how you think the Indo-Pacific has evolved and Australia's role within it since your time as ambassador to China.
Okay. Well, I think the biggest development has been the continual, inexorable growth of China and how China bears on all relations in the region, has become, if you like, the preeminent power in the region. Not necessarily military power, but all countries in the region regard China as their single biggest export market. And its influence through trade, investment, infrastructure construction, and all of that has deepened its reach and influence across the whole region. So, if you like, that's the new regional reality. And the Indo-Pacific itself is a strange concept. I've never been very enthusiastic to talk about it because essentially it's code for using India to balance China as the regional power. And I can see the strategic logic of that, but whether it's practical and feasible and what is the nature of the challenge that we face from China, most of that goes without discussion. But I think to go back to your question, the biggest change has been the ascendancy of China.
And does that include the shoals, reefs, and atolls of the South China Sea and the projection, say, regional maritime hegemony and things like that?
Yeah, well, I mean, they're still under contention, of course, and they are potential flashpoints for serious conflict in the region. But China has fairly effectively put its foot through its programs of building airstrips and things on atolls, effectively put its foot on much of that territory, and that is just what I think one of those realities of life that strategic policymakers really need to come to grips with. It's not going to be feasible, I don't think, really to turn that around. Beijing is determined to keep that presence, and we could argue forever about the legitimacy or otherwise of it, but it is a strategic reality of today.
And we're also seeing potentially neighbors with more skin in the game regarding that region coming to the table potentially a little bit more than Canberra is at the moment around some of these issues.
Yeah, no, precisely, Joel. And Canberra has aligned itself very much with the US position on this. I think the outlier in the region would be the Philippines under the current president, but not under the previous president of the Philippines. But for most of the other countries in the region, they seem to be prepared to engage with China on a regional basis, whereas China does not want those outside the region to be involved in this discussion.
So, looking at Albanese's visit to China recently, which channeled some Whitlam-esque moments. I think he standed on the same section of wall as Gough did before him. So how can Australia look? I mean, it was quite a positive outcome by all accounts. How can Australia balance its relationships with China and US in the wake of this? And what would a return to pragmatism look like in this current environment?
Yeah, look, I think this is the big conundrum for Australian foreign policy, and there's no easy direct answer to it. We have enormous economic interests, and I think the Prime Minister has been very careful and I think very good at making clear that when he speaks about China, that China makes a huge contribution to the Australian economy, to Australian jobs and welfare. And we just have to figure out how to manage these two pressures in our foreign policy. But I think the government at the current time is doing that fairly well. What's changed, I think, in the last year or so has been with the election of Trump. We have a much less ideologically driven White House than we had before. Previously, the dominant theme in US foreign policy for over a century has been US exceptionalism. And if that is what you're pursuing, as US foreign policy has tended to do, then US primacy becomes essential, which means that China needs to, that means that the US needs to be the preeminent power over China. But Trump doesn't seem to care or know or understand anything about US exceptionalism. He just wants to do a deal. And if that's the case, primacy no longer is at the core of US foreign policy with respect to China. And there's a possibility of a more pragmatic set of policies that provides strategic space to an ascendant China, whilst safeguarding all our respective national interests. And I think that's sort of the point where we're getting to, and it makes it a bit easier for Australia to balance the two key elements of our foreign strategic policy: deep economic engagement with China, and reliance on US strategic support.
Seems like the status quo of Obama's pivot to Asia period is now being challenged, even in the foreign policy class in Washington. So, are we seeing the containment of China, in the Taiwan Strait potentially being revised in the decision-making areas of Washington? Could this line or this delineation maybe move back an island chain or potentially go back towards Guam eventually?
Yeah, you have to talk to people more expert about Washington than me. But as far as I can see, there are two competing tendencies in Washington. One are the old, what I would call inside the Beltway views, which are based on US exceptionalism and seeking US primacy, and therefore a policy of containing China. But there's another very strong view, which I would associate with Trump and the MAGA movement people, that let's just get on and cut a deal with China. Now, that has implications for Taiwan. It may be the case that the US doesn't have the same resolve to defend Taiwan on the grounds of principles such as defending democracy as they once did. So I think it's not quite clear where US policy is landing, but I think that with Trump's political power, influence, and standing at present, that things really are much more in the pragmatic, just do a deal, transactional space, and less concern about containing China. On the military aspect that you're alluding to with the first island chain, I think there's a bit of misunderstanding about that as well. That's always been central to US policy with respect to China. And essentially, the first island chain runs from Okinawa down through Taiwan and into the South China Sea. And it hasn't been primarily about keeping China bottled up. It's been primarily, I think, about the defense of Taiwan against any Chinese aggression. So as far as keeping China's Navy bottled up, China's Navy is all over the place already. So if maintaining the first island chain was regarded as being central to keeping China's Navy at home, it hasn't worked at all. China's Navy is everywhere it wants to be. And if you know the geography, it looks good on a map, but there's plenty of avenues for China to expand its Navy into blue water areas.
And we are seeing China now possessing the most tonnage on the planet as far as shipping is the naval shipping is concerned. And I saw recently the 80th anniversary of the surrender of Japan, and there was some military hardware on display there that once again is shifting the balance within that region, including some autonomous underwater vessels and things like that, which are pointing towards making our quite classic retro-looking Virginia-class submarines that we may or may not get. Looking a little bit older every day. I want to speak to you because you mentioned that Australia clings to US primacy still with its decision making. And it feels like there's a bit of a musical chairs going on where even, say, South Korea and Japan now are starting to develop their own story or tale to tell away from Washington. How can Australia prepare for this inevitable shift towards multipolarism? And could BRICS play a role? I also want to ask if it's ever possible for Australia to consider such a thing.
Okay, a few things there, Joel. In my book that I wrote in 2020, which has just come out in a revised edition in May of this year, the last section I called Australia's dystopian future. I foreshadowed exactly the situation that we're in today, that Australia is going to have to learn to navigate and find its way in a multipolar world. And that is the world we now find ourselves in. And that's been accelerated, if you like, under Trump, who is not in any way putting the same attention on networks of alliances that previous administrations had done. So to a large extent, we're on our own already in a multipolar world. And I just think we need to rely more heavily on our own diplomacy, on our own smarts. We need to be creative, nimble in our foreign policy. We need to look at building alliances and networks and engaging in regional and multilateral diplomacy wherever we can and however we can to the best we can. And I think we have a history of doing that. People tend to forget that Australia created APEC, it created the Cairns Group. We solved the Cambodian peace issue. We created the Regional Conference on People Smuggling. There's a whole lot of things that Australian middle power, as it used to be called, diplomacy can and should be doing now. And I think that's a very important way of locking China in to a whole lot of regional discourse and activities. At the same time, we do need to maintain liberal alliances so that China, if it exercises bad behavior, will come to understand that there's a cost to bad behavior. But it's multifaceted, multi-fronted, and that's really what we have to deal with. So I think that's how we navigate our way in this multipolar world.
So, how does our 2024 National Defence Strategy allude to potentially, or not allude to that future? With the I'm speaking to the approach to AUKUS and the Quad, and does it limit our strategic autonomy going forward?
Yeah, well, look, I'm not a military expert, so I'll defer to others on this, but we have shifted fundamentally from defence of the continent to forward defence. And I think most people would argue that forward defence really is about maintaining US primacy. And the main threat that we would see in that scenario is a Chinese unprovoked attack on Taiwan. Many, including former Prime Minister Paul Keating, would argue we have no national interest at stake in Taiwan. The only issue at stake is our support for US primacy, and hence seeing it as essential to maintaining the alliance with the US. I think the Defence White Paper has made a profound shift. I would argue that that shift is not consistent with diplomacy in a multipolar world. And many of our regional neighbours looking at us, I think, feel that we speak with a forked tongue. On one hand, we say we want a region where no one power dominates and no one is dominated. But at the same time, our actions like AUKUS or stationing long-range strategic bombers of the US in Tyndall base or opening up Sterling to US nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed submarines, all of that is about maintaining US primacy. So there's a deep contradiction, I think, between our strategic posture and our foreign policy stance. You mentioned earlier, and I didn't finish it, Joel, about the BRICS, the emerging group from the south, led by China. The BRICS, I think, already are playing a very significant role. It's interesting to me to see how they've already attracted the attention of Trump, the US president. I think they were largely ignored until now. And one of the issues that is bothering Trump is the BRICS determination to decrease, not replace, it's not going to happen, but decrease reliance on the US dollar as the global reserve currency. And that would be a significant weakening of US global power if that shift were to develop to a great extent. So the BRICS are already, I think, an effective counterweight to the US globally. But I don't see that there is any need or basis for Australia to become an active participant in the BRICS.
So the gong of de-dollarization is being heard in the Beltway via BRICS. And now Washington seems to think it's public enemy number one to some extent. We're seeing the Treasury, Besant and people like that starting to speak quite viscerally about BRICS and the need to disrupt. Before we move on to, you mentioned, engaging in the region as a middle power, and I'd love to get onto ASEAN engagement after this, but I just want to ask you first, how important is it that Australia navigates the tensions with Taiwan and the South China Sea, and how could navigating those tensions actually provide a good outcome for us? I'm just thinking about what stance can we take on this issue that will allow us to sort of have our cake and eat it too in this multipolar Asia.
Yeah, um, I think I think we don't need to be a high-profile, active, vocal supporter of efforts to challenge China on either Taiwan or the South China Sea. There, there are enough constraints on China's behavior, I think, for us not to have to be alarmed by what China does. As I said, it's already put a footprint down in any case, and that's pretty much now part of the existing strategic furniture that we just have to work around. And with Taiwan, I've always said I don't think China has a military option in Taiwan. I think the threat of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is greatly overstated in the West, and particularly by the United States and also in Canberra. If you look at how little Putin's achieved with his invasion of Ukraine, which is a contiguous landmass, China would have to cross 130 kilometers of sea in order to effect a naval invasion of Taiwan, and the vulnerabilities there are enormous. Plus, China is much more dependent on world markets for everything it needs to survive than Russia. I mean, some people describe Russia as a gas station run by gangsters. It's a useful concept because the contrast with China couldn't be greater.
Yeah, you've got this incredibly flexing mercantile economy that has supply chains in every single nation state on the planet. It's a completely different consideration, and potentially China is taking quite a pragmatic and open palmed approach to dealing with some of these matters, which we saw with the GCC, ASEAN China summit, and a couple of other recent diplomatic moves with, say, India recently, which was just showing just an impressive wolf warrior diplomacy isn't essentially what we're seeing at the moment, right?
No, that's been buried. Thank goodness. It was a disaster for China. I think they've learned the lesson, and now they're in a recovery phase. What I would say, though, with wolf warrior diplomacy is that even if you bury it, unfortunately for China, now the memory of it won't be expunged anytime soon, and I think they've harmed their diplomatic standing. In other respects, China's in a very comfortable position. Russia's being weakened all the time by its invasion of Ukraine. Because of what you said, Joel, the supply links and interdependencies between China and the US and the West more generally, Trump has continually postponed any of his nasty punitive tariff measures aimed against China. They haven't been implemented. China, I think, is in a very strong position, both economically and in terms of diplomacy.
And they seem to have the ability to economically counteract anything that's thrown at them. I want to like point towards the recent decree on Nvidia to give 20% of their profits to the Trump White
Yeah.
House, followed days later with Beijing making the decision that Huawei and all Chinese suppliers are to put a moratorium on Nvidia products. It's you know, these companies are stuck between a rock and a hard place, and I imagine Taiwan's feeling this increasingly every day. I point to Elbridge Colby on a stage with some TSMC people I saw about a year ago, where he kind of half quit that America would not think twice about bombing TSMC if China came near them. Haven't I heard
Yeah.
something about TSMC putting in some orders for some S-400 missiles, anti-aircraft systems from Russia? So it's an
Oh,
incredible development just going on there, and the shift happening, behind the scenes is so stark and sharp that Australia can't really set its watch to it, right?
yeah. No.
So, look, I just want to speak about Wong's Indonesia trip. I think it's quite
Yeah.
an important moment. She looked at it with a very shiny half glass full, quoting about how important and enduring the relationship is. But some would say that it is quite neglected, really, and it's been running on autopilot for quite some time. We're seeing Wong really push towards this ASEAN engagement. And I was wondering if this is a bit of a hedge right now to what's going on with the major powers, and if this is the beginning of us looking to enhance our strategic position through regional partnerships.
Yeah, no, look, most definitely. And it's what I pointed out in my book of 2020, that we must do that. That's absolutely essential. We have to do two things. One, maintain a strong, constructive, positive, forward-looking relationship with China, and then do everything we can to build a much closer, more trusted relationship with ASEAN. And ASEAN is key in terms of not only hedging against China, but in terms of all the opportunities that it offers Australia, both commercially and diplomatically. So it is the right strategy. And it is, going back to our earlier discussion, Joel, very much what we should be doing as a middle power in a multipolar world.
Totally. And ASEAN engagement seems to be something we've almost been there and somewhat halfway and a little bit almost. And I can go back to the troubled Dr. Mahathir days in my lifetime, where Australia's been sitting on the precipice of ASEAN in so many ways.
Yes, yes.
Could we look at a period where we're actually going to buy into the region and hammer a stake into the ground and be a part of this regional community properly?
Yeah, I mean, we have to recognize, its diversity. ASEAN is a regional grouping, but it contains great diversity. I mean, even things like our Middle East policies, our policies on Palestine, that has a bearing on our standing and influence and relationships with the region. Indonesia is the world's biggest Muslim country. So you don't do something like what Morrison did during the Wentworth by-election some years ago, and just announce that we're going to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem following Trump. It's nuts. It might be okay for the US to say that, but there are these considerations, and we are not good, in my own experience, of factoring those complexities into our decision making. The same thing goes back to when Julia Gillard was standing in Darwin gushing next to Barack Obama when he announced increased troop rotations through Darwin. An ABC journalist asked an old mate of mine, the Foreign Minister of Indonesia, Marty Natalegawa, what he thought about it, put a camera in his face, and Marty instantly said, "Oh, I didn't realize that Australia saw Indonesia as an imminent military threat." The subtext being, why didn't you give us a heads up? Why didn't you warn us? Our instincts in Australia are not to trust ASEAN, not to trust the ASEAN countries, not to care very much about their cultural, historical diversity. Remember, these are countries that have emerged from European colonialism, where to a certain extent we continue to embrace European colonialism. We have the Union Jack on our flag, which is noticed in the region. And when we feel insecure and threatened by China, we turn not to the region and be part of regional security, but we turn to the United States and the UK, the Anglosphere. And as I say, I'm not an expert on the military side or the technical side of AUKUS, but what I do say is that it's not very helpful for us in terms of foreign policy because it's saying to the region that we don't really feel comfortable or that we belong here, but that we still want to be aligned with the Anglosphere, the US and the UK. All of that makes it more difficult for us to build trust and gain the confidence of partners in ASEAN.
Totally. And the recent treaty with the UK is just an example of just the folly of our foreign policy right now.
Yeah.
I mean, we're doubling up on this Union Jack. And you mentioned that Union Jack being a bit of a pariah. I wonder what a bit of a flag change and just a, even if it's just a superficial diplomatic appearance change could do to us in the region alone. Just even changing that flag. I think about the century of humiliation and that Union Jack flying over Hong Kong, the way China might look at that. But then also say with Malaysia and Indonesia, as you mentioned, Indonesia having a hospital that's almost been destroyed in Gaza, and that complete and utter disconnect here in our decision makers. Some of these statements we're making. I mean, the coalition alone looks to set us up to be a pariah at the bottom of the earth with two connections to London and Washington. Um,
Yeah.
I want to ask you about like this neglected Southeast Asian experience for Australia and how we could potentially leverage partnerships, including with China and Indonesia. I want to speak to that nickel project that Indonesia, essentially demanded from Beijing to help them set up. It was a multi-billion-dollar project, but ended up being sovereign, favorably in the sovereign for Indonesia. Does
Mm.
Australia have a neglected history in engaging with our regional partners on some of these big projects? And can we look to start initiating these projects?
One of the reasons why we trade so much with China and we don't trade so much with Southeast Asia is that the um, the Australian economy and the Chinese economy are profoundly complementary in terms of the resources and the income levels and demand. Many of the countries in our immediate neighborhood, Southeast Asia, have similar resource endowments that we do. And so there is not the same profound complementarity. There is in other areas, I think in services, particularly financial education services, tourism, but there's not the same deep complementarity. So it's a different sort of engagement. I think the best thing we've done over the last 20 years, which is very positive and constructive, is we have by and large maintained an open economy and a welcoming attitude to foreign investment from the region. Unfortunately, we have started to, because security concerns are starting to dominate economic considerations in Australia, we have essentially severely constrained Chinese foreign investment into Australia, which limits the opportunity then for that deeper engagement that you're referring to. But historically, we started the iron ore trade with China. We saw in the 80s that China was going to need, if they were going to industrialize, as they said they wanted to, they would need a huge amount of iron ore. And we said to the Chinese, well, this is a joint endeavor between the two of us. And the Mount China Iron Ore project came out of those considerations. So we have done it in the past with China. It makes sense because of the huge complementarity. It's less obvious in most ways in Southeast Asia. But the main thing for us is to continue to maintain an open economy and a welcoming attitude to foreign investment.
Adding to that, I wanted to ask you, we're seeing like large immigration coming in to stock the Productivity Commission in Australia. And we've looked at economic diversification to kind of wean us off that China dependency over time. But that seems to be, it could. almost look like economic replacement when it comes to moving to India as a priority. And then we've seen large migrant flows, large trade deals, like deals with the universities and things like that that have been very India centric over time. Now, with their non-aligned foreign policy and the way that they're approaching the region, they're not as locked in as potentially as some of our regional partners are to shared interests. And I want to ask you this question. Why haven't we had immigration coming in from Southeast Asia and more business engagement with those nations around us? That's just a question for myself, really.
Oh, most of us smaller, but we have quite a lot of immigrants from Southeast Asia. A very big education exchange with Southeast Asia. Um, um, but it's not of the scale of India and China, just because those places are a lot smaller, so
Yep.
it's less obvious. But in the 70s, when at the end of the Vietnam War, and when there was the conflict in Cambodia, Australia took, on a per capita basis, more refugees from Indochina, as it was called, than any other country in the world.
Under Fraser.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, yeah.
Yep.
So no, we've always played our part. We've always been there. I think again, this is what's often very disappointing about where we are today in policy terms. We have over the years have a very good track record in terms of engagement with Southeast Asia. Um, it will not have the commercial dimensions of our engagement with China. That's just obvious, as I said, because of the comparative advantages, the difference in comparative advantage. But we need to build on many of the big constructive things and positive things we've done with the region, and think of more creative ways of engaging the region. One thing I often talk about is that we're the biggest energy producer exporter in the region, perhaps biggest energy exporter in the world. Um, and China in particular is the biggest energy importer. We really need to be working on a major government-to-government framework for addressing the issues of energy security and climate change.
I agree. And issues that are very, very important to our neighbors as well at the moment, including mostly in the Pacific.
Exactly, exactly. And so a country like Australia, with our huge energy production, we should be out there as a regional leader on all of these conversations.
And we're missing out, particularly in the Pacific, on a lot of opportunities in that space by being that deputy for Washington, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I'm not sure it's a very sensible policy that we should focus our policies on in the Pacific in terms of competition with China, because we then just get played off in a bidding war with China.
Totally. That's got a story to tell, and I think like the last 5 years or so, the evolution in that area, particularly around the Solomon Islands and Tonga, Vanuatu, all these sort of areas. I would like to ask you then about this concept called strategic equilibrium. And you've spoken about it, and other nations are talking about it, and it's starting to be sort of spoken in the same sentence as multipolarism. So I would like to ask you how Australia could adopt strategic equilibrium to strengthen its sovereignty and its clout as a nation.
Well, I'm actually quite critical of the concept of strategic equilibrium. I know the foreign minister likes to talk about it. Penny Wong likes to talk about it for the region. We're looking for strategic equilibrium. But the reality is we're in the middle of an ongoing and probably never-ending great power contest for primacy in the region. And so there is no equilibrium. And you can't have equilibrium if an ascendant power is challenging the dominant power. That's the situation we're in. There can't be equilibrium because you've got power shifts going on.
And that Thucydides trap and the inevitability that they make this so. But it seems to be in lieu of just thinking of other ideas about other solutions and how to navigate and walk through that problem. Graham Allison might be remembered as the guy that helped to end the world one day with that kind of that theory. So, looking at the way we've engaged with economic diversification, and how that's seen as a bit of a hedge to, help our over dependency on China, and there may or may not be some progress in that space. But what about the concept, and I'm just throwing this out here, of diplomatic diversification, to hedge our over reliance on Washington? Now, I know regional institutions and regional engagement is the way to begin, but how could that actually look? Diversifying our diplomacy.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've made some good starts. I thought it was very, very significant under Malcolm Turnbull that the ASEAN countries agreed to have a summit meeting in Australia. That was in 2016, and there's been a subsequent one. So that's really elevating our um, connections with and engagement with ASEAN. And that's the sort of thing I think we should be continuing to do. I think we should continue to put effort into APEC. I do firmly believe that we should be an advocate for China becoming a member of the CCPTP, if I've got the acronym right, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Um, we tend to be quite negative about China's participation, but China's keen. We should have a policy always of seeking to engage China in any regional forum or mechanism, because ultimately they become disciplines on China's behavior and actions. And if China could come up to the level of membership that's required, if other members agree on a consensus basis for China to come in, there's no reason why we shouldn't be supportive. Again, I mean, I'm getting a bit long in the tooth, so I tend to go back to examples a long way in the past. But in 1986, when China first announced at the early stages of its reform that it wanted to join then the GATT, which was the predecessor of the WTO, Australia was the first to welcome it. And we actually paid for a trade policy lawyer to sit inside the Chinese Ministry of Commerce at the time to help them draft their first protocol of accession. That's the sort of stuff. It's practical, and it's how you engage these countries.
Wow, maybe we can get a couple of like tooling engineers or something like that to come over here and help us build an industry or something in return, hey?
Maybe they can build a fast train for us.
Yeah, that would be great. In lieu of anything else going on in the background, I think this green steel deal made with Beijing hopefully could be the beginning of something like that if it's a viable and profitable option and everyone's happy. Look,
Yeah, just
oh, sorry.
just on that, that's a good example of what I think a joint commission between Australia and China on energy security and climate change could actually do. Bring all the elements of official policy on both sides together to see if you can make this happen. I think, if you read Ross Garnaut's books, Energy Superstate or Taxing Carbon, if you read those books, there is a compelling case to at least try.
Totally.
Uh, but again, this is something where an active middle power like Australia, which it's got creative diplomacy, this is what we can do and we can lead on. I really get the sense that these days we're shy of showing any leadership, but we are one country that's extremely well suited to do this.
The personality types in leadership right now in Australia and the concentration of the press and the new type of person that we have in leadership in media and the way that they perceive their role has changed a lot over time. Before I know we're running out of time, but I would love to sort of just touch briefly on armed neutrality, and it's something that I personally have been interested in. I think it's integral to having a proper sovereign approach to the region. And we've had David Martin's armed neutrality. We've had Sam Roggeveen's echidna strategy, and there's been a history of people that have been dreaming in the language of sovereign defense. But what could a sovereign defense capability look like? And also, do you think that with this talk and some of the, I don't know, some of the recent discussions from Miles indicating that there are some more sovereign defence considerations that are being looked at. How could Australia awaken to the idea of sovereign defence and armed neutrality?
Again, I don't profess expertise in this area, and I think you've named some people who have written extensively and very well on this, and that you need to add Hugh White
Totally.
into that mix as well. I'm very much in agreement with what Hugh says, but it's interesting. Maybe I could just reflect on your comment about Miles. Like, it wasn't so long ago we were all the way with the USA and tossing everything into maintaining US primacy. Now, if there's starting to be a sort of discussion of sovereign defence again, what bothers me is it looks like our security policy is just flip-flopping based on the latest sort of reading of where the White House is at, or where the inside the Beltway in Washington is at. And that's a big problem. And some of us for a very long time, Hugh White, myself, others, have always cautioned about basing our security on assumptions about US commitment to the region and US commitment to defending allies.
It really feels over the last couple of decades that a presidential term is enough to really unseat us from the continuity of what we're trying to achieve here. And potentially, just our over involvement and our over obsession with looking towards the Beltway for their memo has left us without paddles to navigate these sort of torrential waters that are flowing around us.
And that's a really, really, really important point, because it goes to the heart of how we think about our strategic settings. There's a tendency to begin with alliance maintenance. There's nothing more important than maintaining the alliance, instead of beginning with what are our real interests and what are our real threats, and trying to understand that. And in the latter, that's where you get to, say, a Paul Keating position, where we must find our security in the region, not from the region. And that's a fundamental difference. And alliance maintenance really goes to finding our security from the region, instead of doing all the hard work and putting the effort into finding our security within the region.
Yeah, and the lack of like sovereign imagination coming out of this country's leaders for decades has left many of us kind of struggling with these ideas on our own, including you and I, about how we could even dream to approach this, because we're not hearing enough of these kind of creative ideas coming out of our leadership. So even myself, I had my own flux capacitor moment, a couple of years ago, where I thought of this concept called MINZAP, Malaysia, Indonesia, New Zealand, Australia, and Pacific, something to do about using the Convention for the Law of the Sea to delineate our own 9-dash line above the shoals reefs and the archipelago of Indonesia, and to say we live in a conflict-free area under this. We can share in boat building. We can look at things that might benefit that new arrangement, and we could draw up a line on this earth and say this is a peaceful part of this earth, and we're going to fight to the tooth to protect that. I mean, that's something I just thought about in lieu of any ideas, and I'm sure you've got many creative ideas as well. But could something like this work? I mean, I'm sure everyone's had their own idea about a version of this.
I think it's fantastic. I've not heard that before. It just intuitively, and on first hearing, makes enormous amount of sense. I mean, again, I keep going back to the past, I apologize, but in the 70s, Australia was a very strong advocate for a number of years of a nuclear-free Pacific. The Americans hated it. But we, with other countries in the region, seriously, and the main problem we had was French nuclear tests in the region, because the French colonial powers were just testing on Pacific reefs and atolls and spreading nuclear waste in the area for nuclear fallout. These are things that we should be talking about. I think it's a great idea, Joel.
Well, you can use that one if you want. It hardly just sits here in the garage, all right? But
I'll try it in my next book.
Yeah, there we go. But it's very interesting that that sort of outlook that we have, and I think we can, yeah, we can evolve and change, and we're being inhibited by some gatekeepers that seem to be on the back foot constantly, Geoff, which is a relief, I think. Finally, I want to ask you before I let you go, what could sovereign Australia engaging in middle power diplomacy look like in the Indo-Pacific to its neighbours?
Well, I think as a responsible country that is coming up with useful ideas, creative diplomacy, prepared to put the resources in to back it. I mean, one of the things we've got to be always careful in Australia, we tend to often have a big mouth, but then when it comes to putting our hand in our pockets are either very deep or our arms are very short. So, we have to back with real commitment of resources. And we need a much, much bigger diplomatic service. And I think we need, frankly, that we should talk more about it, much more diversity in our think tanks. There is great conformity between the main think tanks in Australia. So there's not really much of a public marketplace in ideas.
And many of them are zero sum Aspie style ideas, which, this good versus evil approach to our future, our strategic future, is just a joke. Um,
Absolutely.
Thank you, Geoff. Absolutely enlightening having you on. And it feels like, yeah, potentially our last muscle memory was that Marua Atoll crisis with the region. That's something I didn't even think about. Maybe that we could tap back and harken back to that a little bit and look at how we could work with our neighbors on some other big ideas. But thank you so much for joining us. And potentially, I'd love to have you on again if you could care to join us in the future.
Well, thanks, Joel. Thanks for having me. I'd love to come back. And really, I encourage you to keep working on MinZap. If you've got a good acronym, you're halfway there.
Well, there we go. If it sounds like a good acronym from you, I might work on that. So yeah, I might put up an article about MinZap and tag you in on it. All right, Geoff?
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Take care. Enjoy your lunch.
Bye bye. Thank
See
you.
ya.